The Music of Erich Zann by H.P. Lovecraft. I have examined many maps of the city with the greatest care, yet I have never again found the Rudin seal. These maps are not mere modern maps alone, for I know names have changed. I have, on the contrary, delved deep into the antiquities of the place, and have personally explored every region of whatever name which could possibly answer to the street I knew as Rue de Seal. But despite all that I have done, it remains an humiliating fact that I cannot find the house, the street, or even the locality where, during the last months of my impoverished life as a student of metaphysics at the university, I heard the music of Erich Zann. That my memory is broken, I do not wonder, for my health, physical and mental, were gravely disturbed throughout the period of my residence at the Rue de Seal, and I recall that I took the name of a few acquaintances there. But I cannot find that place again, which is both singular and perplexing, for it was within half an hour's walk of the university, and was distinguished by the peculiarities which should hardly be forgotten by anyone who'd been there. Yet I never met a person who had seen the Rue de Seal. The Rue de Seal lay across a dark river bordered by precipitous black briar windowed warehouses, and spanned by a ponderous bridge of dark stone. It was always shadowy along that river, as if smoke of the neighbouring factories shut out the sun perpetually. The river was also odious with an evil stench which I'd never smelt elsewhere, which may someday help me to find it, since I should recognise them at once. Beyond the bridge were narrow cobbled streets with rails, and then came the ascent, at first gradual, but increasingly steep as the Rue de Seal was reached. I've never seen another street as narrow and as steep as the Rue de Seal. It was almost a cliff, close to all vehicles, consisting of several places of flights of steps, ending at the top a lofty ivied wall. Its paving was irregular, sometimes stone slabs, sometimes cobblestones, sometimes bare earth, with struggled greenish-grey vegetation. The houses were tall, peaked roof, incredibly old, and crazily leaning backwards and forwards and sideways. Occasionally an opposite pair would lean forward, almost meeting across the street like an arch, and certainly they kept most of the light from the ground below. There were a few overhead bridges from house to house across the street. The inhabitants of the street impressed me particularly. At first I thought it was because they were all silent and reticent, but later decided it was because they were all very old. I do not know how I came to live in such a street, but I was not myself when I moved there. I had been living in many poor places, always evicted for the want of money, until at last I came across the tottering house at Rue de Seal, kept by the paralytic Blando. It was the third house on the top of the street, and by far the tallest of them all. My room was on the 5th floor, only inhabited room there, since the house was almost empty. On the night I arrived, I heard the strange music from the peat garret overhead, and the next day I asked old Blando about it. He told me it was an old German viola player, a strange dumb man who signed his name Erich Zann, and who played evenings in a cheap theatre orchestra, adding that Zann's desire to play it in the night after his return to the theatre was the reason he had chosen his lofty and isolated garret room, whose single gabled window was the only point on the street where one could look over the terminating wall at the declivity and the panorama beyond. Thereafter I heard Zann every night, and although he kept me awake, I was haunted by the weirdness of his music. Knowing little of the art myself, yet I was certain that none of his harmonies had any relation to music I'd ever heard before, and concluded that he was a composer of highly original genius. The longer I listened, the more I was fascinated, until after a week I resolved to make the old man's acquaintance. One night, as I was returning from work, I intercepted Zann in the hallway and told him that I would like to know him and be with him when he played. He was a small, lean, bent person, with shabby clothes, blue eyes, a grotesque satyr-like face, and nearly a bald head. At my first words he seemed both angered and frightened. My obvious friendliness, however, finally melted him, and he grudgingly motioned for me to follow him in the dark, creaking, rickety attic stairs. His room was one of only two in the steeply pitched garret, was on the west side towards the high wall that formed the upper end of the street. Its size was very great, and it seemed greater because of its extraordinary bareness and neglect. Of furniture there was only a narrow iron bedstead, a dingy washstand, a small table, a large bookcase, and an iron music rack, and 3 old-fashioned chairs. Sheets of music were piled in disorder about the floor. The walls were bare boards, and probably never seen plaster. Whilst the abundance of dust and cobwebs made the place seem more deserted than inhabited, evidently Erich Zann's world of beauty lay in some far cosmos of the imagination. Motioning me to sit down, the dumb man closed the door, turned the large bolt, and lighted a candle to augment the one he had brought with him. He now removed his viol from its moth-eaten covering, seated himself in the least uncomfortable of the chairs. He did not employ the music rack, but offered no choice, and playing from memory enchanted me for over an hour with strains I had never heard before, strains which must have been of his own devising. To describe the exact nature is impossible for one unversed in music. They were a kind of fugue, with recurrent passages almost captivating quality, but to me were of notable for the absence of any weird notes I had overheard from my room below on the other occasions. Those haunting notes I had remembered, and often hummed and whistled inaccurately to myself. So when the player at length laid down his bow, I asked him if he would render some of them. As I began my request, the wrinkled star's face lost the bored placidity that it had possessed during my playing, and seemed to shew some curious mixture of anger and fright, which I had noticed when I first accosted the old man. For a moment I was inclined to use persuasion regarding rather lightly the whims of senility, and even tried to awaken my host's weirder mood by whistling a few strains to which I had listened the night before. But I did not pursue this course for more than a moment. When the dumb musician recognised the whistled air, his face grew suddenly distorted with an expression wholly beyond analysis, and his long, cold, bony right hand reached out to stop my mouth and silence the crude imitation. As he did this, he further demonstrated his eccentricity by casting a startled glance towards the lone curtained window, as if fearful of some intruder, a glance doubly absurd since the garret stood high and inaccessible above all the adjacent roofs, this window being the only point in the street, as the concierge had told me, from which one could see over the wall at the summit. The old man's glance brought Brando's comment to my mind, and with a certain capriciousness I felt a wish to look out over the wide dazzling panorama of the moonlit roofs and the city that lies beyond the hilltop, which of all the dwellers of the Rue de Sille only this crabbed musician could see. I moved towards the window and would have drawn aside the nondescript curtains, when a frightened rage even greater than before the dumb lodger was upon me, this time motioning his head towards the window as he nervously strove to drag me hither with both hands. Now thoroughly disgusted at my host, I ordered him to release me and told him I would go at once. His clutch relaxed, and as he saw my disgust and offence, his own anger seemed to subside. He tightened his relaxing grip, but this time in a friendly manner, forcing me into the chair. Then, with an appearance of wistfulness, crossing to the littered table, where he wrote many words with a pencil in the laboured French of a foreigner. The note which he finally handed me was an appeal for tolerance and forgiveness. Zann said that he was old, lonely, and afflicted by strange fears and nervous disorders connected with his music and other things. He had enjoyed my listening to his music, and wished I would come again and not mind his eccentricities. But he could not play for another his weird harmonies, and could not bear hearing them from another, nor could he bear having anything in this room touched by another. He did not know until our hallway conversation that I could overhear his playing in the room, and now asked me if I would arrange with Blando to take a lower room where I could not hear him in the night. He would, he wrote, defray the difference in rent. I sat deciphering the execrable French. I felt more lenient towards the old man. He was a victim of physical and nervous suffering, as was I, and my metaphysical studies had taught me kindness. In the silence there came a slight sound from the window. The shutter must have rattled in the night wind, and, for some reason, I startled almost as violently as did Erich Zann. So when I had finished reading, I shook my host by the hand and departed as a friend. The next day Blando gave me a more expensive room on the third floor, between the apartments of an aged moneylender and the room of a respected upholsterer. There was no one on the fourth floor. It was not long before I found that Zann's eagerness for my company was not as great as it had seemed while he was persuading me to move down from the fifth story. He did not ask me to call on him, and when I did, he appeared uneasy and played listlessly. This was always at night. In the day he slept and would admit no one. My liking for him did not grow, although the attic room and the weird music seemed to hold a fascination for me. I had a curious desire to look out from that window, over the wall and down the unseen slopes of the glistening roofs and spires, which must lie outspread there. Once I went up to the garret during the theatre hours when Zann was away, but the door was locked. What I did succeed in doing was to overhear the nocturnal playing of the dumb old man. At first I would tiptoe up to the fifth floor. Then I grew bold enough to climb to the least creaking staircase to the peaked garret. There in the narrow hall outside the bolted door of the covered keyhole, I often heard sounds which filled me with an indefinable dread. A dread of vague wonder and brooding mystery. It was not the sounds that were hideous, for they were not, but they held vibrations suggesting nothing on this globe of earth. At certain intervals they seemed a symphonic quality which I could hardly conceive as the producer of one player. Certainly Erich Zann was a genius of wild power. As the weeks passed, his playing grew wilder, whilst the old musician acquired an increasing haggardness and furtiveness, pitiful to behold. He now refused to meet me at any time, and shunned me whenever we met on the stairs. One night, as I was listening at the door, I heard the shrieking viol swell into a chaotic babble of sound. A pandemonium which would have led me to doubt my own shaking sanity had there not come from behind the barrelled portal a piteous proof that the horror was real. The awful, inarticulate cry which only a mute can utter, and which rises only in moments for the most terrible fear and anguish. I knocked repeatedly at the door, but received no response. Afterwards I waited in the black hallway, shivering with cold and fear, till I heard the poor musician's feeble efforts to rise from the floor by the aid of the chair. Believing him to be just conscious after a fainting fit, I renewed my rapping, at the same time calling out his name reassuringly. I heard Zann stumble to the window and close both shutter and sash, then stumble to the door, which he falteringly unfastened to admit me. This time his delight at having me present was real, for his distorted face gleamed with relief while clutching at my coat as a child clutches at his mother's skirts. Shaking pathetically, the old man forced me into a chair whilst he sank into another, beside which viol and bow lay carelessly on the floor. He sat for some time inactive, nodding oddly, but having the paradoxical suggestion of intense and frightened listening. Subsequently he seemed to be satisfied, and crossing to a chair by the table wrote a brief note and handed it to me. I returned to the table, where he began to write rapidly and incessantly. The note implored me in the name of mercy and for the sake of my own curiosity to wait while he prepared a full account in German of all the marvels and terrors which beset him. I waited, and the dumb man's pencil flew. It was perhaps an hour later, while I still waited, and while the old man's feverishly written sheets still continued to pile up, that I saw Zann start from his hint of a horrible shock. Unmistakably he was looking at the curtained window and listening shudderingly. Then I half fancied I heard a sound myself, though it was not a horrible sound, but rather it was an exquisitely low and indefinitely distant musical note, suggesting a play in one of the neighbouring houses, or some abode beyond the lofty wall over which I could never able to look. Upon Zann the effect was terrible. He dropped his pencil suddenly as he rose, seized his viol, and commenced to rend the night with the wildest playing I had ever heard from his bow, save when listening at the barrelled door. It would be useless to describe the playing of Erich Zann on this dreadful night. It was more horrible than anything I had ever overheard, because I could now see the expression on his face, and could realise this time the motive of stark fear. He was trying to make a noise, to ward off something or drown something out. What? I could not imagine, also though I felt it must be. The playing grew fantastically delirious and hysterical, yet kept the last qualities of supreme genius which I knew the strange old man possessed. I recognised the air. It was a wild Hungarian dance, popular in the theatres, and I reflected for a moment that it was the first time I'd ever heard Zann play work by another composer. Louder and louder, wilder and wilder, mounted the shrieking and whining of that desperate viol. The player was drooping with an uncanny perspiration which twisted like a monkey, always looking frantically at the curtained window. In his frenzied strains I could almost see shadowy satyrs and bacchanals dancing and whirling insanely through the seething abysses of cloud and smoke and lightning. And then I thought I heard a shriller, steadier note that was not from the viol, a calm, deliberate, purposeful, mocking note from far away in the west. At this juncture the shutter began to rattle in a howling night wind which sprung up outside as if in answer to the mad playing within. Zann's screaming viol now outdid itself, emitting sounds that I never thought a viol could emit. The shutter rattled more loudly, unfastening, and commenced slamming against the window. Then the glass broke, shiveringly under the persistent impacts, and a chill wind rushed in, making the candles sputter and rattling the sheets of paper on the table as Zann began to write out his horrible secret. I looked at Zann and saw that he was past conscious observation. His blue eyes were bulging, glassy and sightless, and the frantic playing had become a blind, mechanical, unrecognisable orgy that no pain could even suggest. A sudden gust, stronger than the others, caught up the manuscript and it bore it towards the window. I followed the flying sheets in desperation, but they were gone before I reached the demolished panes. And then I remembered my old wish to gaze out from this window, the only window in the Rue de Sille from which one might see the slopes beyond the wall and the city outspread beneath. It was very dark, but the city lights always seemed blurred, and I expected to see them there amidst the rain and wind. Yet, when I looked from the highest of all gable windows, looked while the candles sputtered and the insane viol howled in the night wind, I saw no city spread below, no friendly lights emitting from remembered streets, only the blackness of space, unimagined space alive with motion and music, and having no semblance of anything on earth. And as I stood there looking out in terror, the wind blew out the candles in that ancient peat garret, leaving me in a savage, impenetrable darkness, with chaos and pandemonium before me, and the demon madness of that night baying viol behind me. I staggered back in the dark without the means of striking a light, crashing against the table, overturning a chair, and finally groping my way to the place where the blackness screamed within the shocking music. To save myself and Erich Zann, I could at least try whatever the powers opposed to me. Once I thought some chill thing brushed me, and I screamed, but my scream could not be heard above the hideous viol. Suddenly, out of the blackness, the madly sewing bow struck me, and I knew I was close to the player. I felt ahead, touched the back of Zann's chair, and then found and shook his shoulder in an effort to bring him to his senses. He did not respond, and the viol shrieked on without slackening. I moved my hands to his head, whose mechanical nodding I was able to stop, and shouted in his ear that we must both flee from the unknown things of the night. But he neither answered nor abated in the frenzy of his unutterable music, while all through the garret strange currents of wind seemed to dance in the darkness and babble. When my hand touched his ear, I shuddered, though I knew not why. I knew not why I felt his still face, ice cold, stiffened, unbreathing face, whose glassy eyes bulged uselessly in the void. And then, by some miracle, I finding the door and the large wooden bolt, I plunged wildly away from that glassy-eyed thing in the dark, and from the ghoulish howling of that accursed viol, whose fury increased as I plunged, leaping, floating, flying down those endless stairs, through the dark house, racing mindlessly out into the narrow, steep, ancient streets and steps of tottering houses, clattering down the steps and over cobbles to the lower streets and the putrid canyon-walled river, panting across the great dark bridge to the broader, healthier streets and boulevards we knew. All these terrible impressions that linger with me, and I recall there was no wind, and the moon was out, and all the lights of the city twinkled. Despite my most careful searches and investigations, I have never since been able to find the Rue de Sille. But I'm not wholly sorry, either for this, or for the loss in undreamable abysses of the closely written sheets which alone could have explained the music of Erich Zann.